Hello, dear friends. Please join me as we listen to today's story. 3 days before Thanksgiving, my mother called me. Do not come home this year. My husband's son has just been appointed CEO. I do not want people comparing him to a woman in the military who lives on a government paycheck. I was silent for a few seconds, then I answered. I understand. On Thanksgiving night, just as the entire family was raising their glasses to congratulate him, the attorney walked in, placed a folder on the table, and said, "The company has a new owner." A few minutes later, my mother called me, her voice trembling. "You are at the base, so why is your signature on the agreement to buy his entire company?" I adjusted the collar of my uniform and answered calmly. "Because I am a soldier, Mom, but I never said that was all I had. My name is Serena Carter. I am 37 years old, and I live in a small brick house on Morganton Road, in the Haymount neighborhood of Fayetteville, North Carolina. On clear mornings, I can stand on my front porch and hear vehicles heading toward the base before sunrise. Those sounds have become part of my life, just like the alarm at 5 in the morning, the smell of black coffee, and the uniforms hanging neatly in my closet. I joined the Army when I was 20. At the time, I did not have some grand plan. I only knew that I wanted to leave the house where every decision I made was treated as temporary, and every success I had was explained away as luck. I started at the lowest level, working in warehouses that felt like furnaces in summer, and cut through your skin with cold in winter. I learned how to account for every case of equipment, coordinate every convoy, and accept responsibility when one item disappeared among thousands of identical containers. Later, I continued my education, passed the required examinations, and became an officer. 17 years later, I held the rank of major and led a logistics unit with hundreds of soldiers. My work did not appear on television. There were no glamorous scenes like the ones in movies. Most of my time was spent looking at transportation maps, budgets, and reports long enough to put almost anyone to sleep. But if a convoy ran out of fuel, if a unit did not receive medical equipment, or if hundreds of soldiers became stranded because someone miscalculated one number, it was my responsibility. I once stayed awake for 30 hours straight to get supplies into an isolated area. I once stood inside a warehouse during a power outage and directed soldiers as they sorted cargo by flashlight. I also once had to call the family of a young soldier after he was injured in an accident while traveling on duty. In the Army, people did not ask whether I deserved to be heard. They looked at my rank, my record, and the way I handled a situation. If I made the right decision, people followed it. If I was wrong, I accepted responsibility. At home, things were different. In my mother's eyes, the Army had never been a real career. It was simply a job I had kept for so long that I no longer knew how to leave it. Whenever I was promoted, she asked how much my pay had increased. When I received a medal, she asked whether it would help me retire earlier. If I had to cancel a trip home because of duty, she sighed, as though I had chosen some strange hobby over my family. She never asked how many people I had commanded. She never asked whether there had been nights when I was afraid. But my mother could tell you exactly what kind of car Daniel had just bought, how many bedrooms were in his new house, and how large his annual bonus had been. Daniel Brooks was the son of Richard, the man my mother married after my father died. He was 3 years younger than I was. When we first met, Daniel was 16, easy to talk to, and always knew exactly when to smile. I never hated Daniel. That is important. He was not the person who created the distance between my mother and me. He simply stepped into a space that already existed, then gradually became accustomed to every eye in the room turning toward him. Daniel studied business, joined Brooks Manufacturing, and rose quickly through the company. The business had been built by Richard's family, manufactured industrial components, and employed more than 600 people. The way my mother told the story, Daniel had built everything himself from nothing. She rarely mentioned that his father owned most of the stock, that Daniel had been given a private office on his first day, or that many people at the company had been working there longer than he had been in the profession. Those details did not fit the story my mother wanted to tell. In her story, Daniel was a gifted, confident, ambitious young man. I was the stubborn daughter who had chosen a life that was too difficult, then had only herself to blame when it did not give her a large house or an expensive car. Every family dinner followed almost the same pattern. My mother asked Daniel about work first. He talked about a new contract, a meeting with investors, or a business trip to Chicago. Richard sat beside him and nodded with satisfaction. Then my mother turned to me and asked when I planned to leave the Army and find a stable job. Once, I had just returned from 6 weeks of training. My shoulder was still sore from carrying equipment for so long, but my mother barely asked how the trip had gone. She simply waited for Daniel to finish telling everyone about his new house, then turned to me. Have you ever considered that you might be too old to keep living on a military base like this? I was 35 at the time. I looked at the neatly folded napkin beside my plate, then at Daniel, who was avoiding my eyes. I have my own house, Mom. My mother gave a small laugh. I mean a real life. No one said anything after that. Daniel looked down and cut the meat on his plate. Richard took a sip of wine. I sat upright and kept my face calm, the same way I did during tense meetings. 17 years in the army had taught me that some words did not require an immediate response. Not because they did not hurt, but because the first response was rarely the wisest one. I spent years convincing myself that my mother did not mean to diminish me. Maybe she simply did not understand the military. Maybe she worried about me. Maybe after losing my father, she needed to hold on to a version of success that was easier to see. Daniel had an expensive car, a new house, and photographs of himself inside a glass office. I had a uniform, calls in the middle of the night, and a job whose most important moments could rarely be discussed outside the army. So my mother chose what she understood. At least, that was the explanation I used for years to protect her. Everything became clearer when Daniel was appointed CEO of Brooks Manufacturing. The announcement was made in early November. My mother called me less than 10 minutes after it appeared on the company website. She was so excited that I had to move the phone away from my ear. She told me about the ceremony, the suit Daniel wore, and how the board of directors had risen to applaud him. She said Richard had nearly cried with pride. Then she mentioned that the entire family would gather at Thanksgiving to celebrate. I told her I would check my duty schedule and book a flight. There was a very brief silence on the other end of the line. At the time, I did not understand what that silence meant. 3 days before Thanksgiving, my mother called again. I was in my office, reviewing a transportation list for an upcoming training exercise. The late afternoon sunlight came through the window and stretched across my desk. She did not ask whether I had booked my flight. She did not ask how work was going. Do not come home this year. I put down my pen. My mother said Daniel was bringing several members of his future wife's family. They were all successful people. There was an attorney, a doctor, and 2 business owners. She did not want the evening to become uncomfortable. I asked what would make it uncomfortable. She waited several seconds before answering. Daniel has just become CEO. I do not want people comparing him to a woman in the military who lives on a government paycheck. She said it softly, almost gently. That was what made it hurt more. She continued, explaining that she only wanted to protect me. She was afraid I would feel out of place while everyone talked about investments, real estate, and business success. She said that sometimes avoiding an uncomfortable situation was the best thing to do. I looked at the photographs on my desk. One showed me standing with my soldiers after a long mission. Another showed Michael, my late husband, smiling beside the old truck we once owned. Then I understood. My mother was not afraid that I would be hurt. She was afraid that my presence would interrupt the evening she had planned to honor Daniel. She did not want to explain why the daughter she had always dismissed held the rank of major. She also did not want any question that might draw the guests' attention away from the golden son of the family. She called it protection. In reality, she was asking me to disappear so someone else could shine without being compared to anyone. I did not argue. I only said, I understand. For the first time in my life, I truly did understand. I ended the call, sat quietly at my desk for several more minutes, then opened my travel schedule on the computer. My flight to Charlotte had been booked almost a month earlier. I planned to arrive Wednesday morning, rent a car, and drive to my mother's house before dark. I had even bought her a gift, a cream-colored shawl she had stopped to admire for a long time when we passed a store in Raleigh. I looked at the flight information for a while, then pressed the cancel button. There was no special sound. There was no noise to announce that a door had just closed between a mother and her daughter. The screen simply displayed a message confirming that the money would be refunded within several business days. Everything happened so neatly that it almost felt cold. I put my phone in the desk drawer, gathered the files on my desk, and went down to the operations area. The unit was finalizing the duty roster for the holiday. Most soldiers with families were trying to trade shifts so they could be home on Thanksgiving night. The younger unmarried soldiers usually accepted what remained without complaining, but I knew some of them were quietly disappointed. Sergeant First Class Olivia Bennett stood beside the duty board, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She was 29, had 2 young children, and a husband who worked in Charlotte. According to the schedule, Olivia was assigned from Thursday afternoon until the following morning. I had heard her tell another soldier that her oldest daughter had spent the entire week drawing a turkey card and was waiting for her mother to bring it home and hang it on the refrigerator. I walked over, looked at the duty board, and asked the duty coordinator whether anyone had volunteered to cover Olivia's shift. The answer was no. I picked up a pen, crossed her name out of the overnight slot, and wrote mine in its place. Olivia looked at me as though she had misheard me. "Major, you do not have to do that. I know, but you have a family too." I looked at my name on the board for another second. Not that night. She started to say something else, but I had already returned the pen to the tray. "Go home to your children, Sergeant Bennett, and do not be late for the Friday morning shift." Her eyes turned red, but she simply came to attention and nodded. I did not want her to thank me too much. Some acts of kindness become heavy when the person receiving them has to carry a sense of debt. That evening, I returned to my house on Morganton Road earlier than usual. Haymount was quiet, and the old trees had lost most of their leaves. Several houses had autumn wreaths hanging on their front doors. Warm yellow light spilled through windows, revealing people moving around their kitchens and preparing for the holiday. I placed my mother's shawl in the bottom drawer, still wrapped in the original paper. Then I took a dark blue folder from the small safe in my home office. The first page carried the name of a private investment company, Carter Meridian Holdings. That name did not appear in any of my military records. It had also never been mentioned at family dinners, during Sunday phone calls, or in any conversation with my mother. For years, she believed my entire life was contained in the government paycheck deposited into my account each month. I had never corrected her. On Thanksgiving morning, I woke at 5 as usual. I went for a short run, took a hot shower, and put on my uniform. Before leaving the house, I opened the refrigerator and looked at the small pumpkin pie a neighbor had brought over the night before. I cut a slice, ate it while standing at the kitchen counter, and finished my coffee. That was my holiday breakfast. By mid-afternoon, the base had become unusually quiet. The hallways that normally echoed with footsteps held only the sound of the air conditioning and the radios from the duty room. In the dining facility, several civilian employees had prepared turkey, mashed potatoes, and green beans for those who could not leave their posts. I ate with 8 other soldiers. We did not say much. Several of them made video calls to their families. One young private turned his screen toward us so everyone could say hello to his mother in Ohio. She cried when she saw her son still wearing his uniform on the holiday. I smiled, but I did not call anyone. At about 7:45 that evening, I returned to my office. Outside the window, the parking lot was almost empty. Security lights shone across rows of military vehicles parked in perfect lines. There were 2 phones on my desk. One belonged to the Army. Only 5 people knew the number of the other one. I placed it in front of me but did not touch it. The legal team had been instructed not to call unless there was a problem. If everything went according to plan, they only needed to send a confirmation message. At exactly 8:03, the screen lit up. The message was from my attorney, Margaret Hale. "The transaction is complete. Ownership took effect at 8 this evening." I read the message twice. I did not feel victorious. There was none of the satisfaction people often imagine when a major plan succeeds. I felt only a deep and heavy stillness, like the moment after signing an order that could change the lives of hundreds of people. I locked the phone and leaned back in my chair. Long before I wore the rank of major, I understood that logistics was not only about trucks, warehouses, and spreadsheets. Logistics was the ability to see how a system operated, where it might break, and what would happen to people when one link in the chain was severed. Michael was the first person to recognize that ability in me. We met when I was 24. He was not in the military. Michael worked as a software engineer for a small transportation company in Greensboro. He had a habit of writing every idea on scraps of paper and leaving them all over the house, from the kitchen table to the backs of utility bills. During a long training assignment, he often listened to me complain about slow cargo tracking systems, duplicate reports, and the hours people wasted checking information that computers should have been able to process. One evening, he spread dozens of sheets of paper across the kitchen table and said we could build a better system. At first, it was only a small project between a husband and wife. I described the processes and pointed out common weaknesses in transportation and warehouse management. Michael wrote the code, tested it, and revised it. We did not use any classified information or military property. The system was designed for civilian transportation companies and focused on predicting delays, detecting losses, and rerouting shipments in real time. We worked at night and on weekends. There were months when neither of us had a real day off. The kitchen became our conference room, the living room filled with diagrams and computers. We argued over every detail, sometimes to the point that we did not speak to each other for several hours. But we believed in what we were creating. 3 years later, a regional transportation company began using the system. Then another company adopted it, then more followed. Michael often said that we did not need to become famous, we only needed to create something truly useful, and the people who needed it would find us. He was right, but Michael did not live long enough to see it. He died in a car accident when he was only 33. For several months after the funeral, I could not open the files we had worked on together. Every line of code and every note made me feel as though he had just stepped out of the room and would return at any moment. Eventually, I had to make a choice. I could let our work disappear along with my grief, or I could finish what Michael had started. I hired an independent group of experts, completed the product, then sold the licensing rights and technology copyrights to a large logistics corporation. The total value of the transaction, after several rounds of payments and converted equity, reached tens of millions of dollars. I did not buy a mansion. I did not replace my car. I continued living in my modest house on Morganton Road and waking before sunrise to report to my unit. Most of the money went into Carter Meridian Holdings, an investment company managed by military veterans, attorneys, and financial professionals. They were responsible for reviewing, negotiating, and managing every investment. I did not participate in daily operations. I retained ownership, approved major decisions, and ensured that no transaction conflicted with my military duties. My mother did not know any of this. Neither did Daniel. I did not keep it secret because I was ashamed. I kept it secret because I had learned that money could change the way people looked at you faster than any accomplishment. I wanted my mother to respect the woman who had served for 17 years, not the woman who had millions of dollars hidden behind accounts she had never known existed. But that Thanksgiving night, while sitting alone in my office on the base, I recognized an uncomfortable truth. My mother had been given many years to see me. She had simply never truly wanted to look. Dear friend, if your own family has ever overlooked you or judged you unfairly, please leave a few words of encouragement for me in the comments. Now, please continue listening to the story. I had known that Brooks Manufacturing was in trouble for months before Daniel was appointed CEO. Carter Meridian Holdings specialized in finding businesses with strong foundations that were being poorly managed. We did not hunt dying companies so we could strip their assets and sell them piece by piece. Michael believed that a business had real value only when it continued creating jobs, supporting families, and keeping its promises to the people who had given their lives to it. I believed the same thing. The Brooks Manufacturing file appeared on the investment team's desk near the end of summer. At first, the Brooks name did not catch my attention. I had seen many businesses named after the families that founded them. It was only when I read the headquarters address and saw Richard Brooks listed among the shareholders that I realized it was my stepfather's company. I immediately asked the legal team to examine any possible conflict of interest. They confirmed that Brooks Manufacturing had no contracts with the Department of Defense, participated in no programs connected to my unit, and could not be affected by my military responsibilities. I did not negotiate directly with Richard or Daniel. Every contact was handled through banks, attorneys, and the independent investment team. I could have withdrawn completely. There were nights when I thought I should. If the acquisition succeeded, my family might claim that I had deliberately targeted Daniel. If it failed, they might say that a woman in the military had entered a field she did not understand and made everything worse. Whatever happened, I knew my mother would see a personal motive before she saw the truth. Then I read the employee list. 618 names. Some had worked at the factory for more than 30 years. Some married couples worked there together. Some families had a father, a son, and a daughter who all depended on paychecks from Brooks Manufacturing. The review team discovered that the company had been late paying suppliers for nearly 4 months. Unpaid taxes exceeded $1 million. A major loan would come due at the beginning of the new year, but the company no longer had enough cash to repay it. Worse, the payroll account held enough money for less than 3 weeks. If the bank refused to extend the loan, the factory would close before Christmas. Daniel might lose his position. Richard might lose his shares. But the 618 workers would be the first people forced to pay the price. I had met too many military families living from one paycheck to the next to view those numbers as nothing more than a lifeless report. One delayed paycheck could mean an unpaid electric bill. 1 month without work could cost someone a home. A pension fund wiped away could erase 30 years of a person's labor with a single signature. That was why I authorized the fund to proceed, not because of Daniel, not because of my mother either. We made a conditional rescue offer. Carter Meridian would pay the urgent debts, guarantee payroll, preserve health insurance, and provide the capital needed to keep the factory operating. In return, the creditors would transfer control of the company to the fund. The bank agreed because the only alternative was bankruptcy. The board of directors agreed because they had no other path left. Richard and Daniel did not have the absolute power to stop it. Most of the family shares had been pledged as collateral for the loans. Once the company violated the terms of its credit agreements, the final decision was no longer entirely theirs to make. At 8 o'clock on Thanksgiving night, the acquisition took effect. I sat in my office on the base, looking at the confirmation message on the screen. More than 100 miles away, my entire family was raising their glasses to congratulate Daniel on a position he might not hold by the following morning. I did not know exactly what was happening at that dinner table until my mother told me about it later. The longtime attorney for Brooks Manufacturing was also at the celebration. Richard had invited him to congratulate Daniel and discuss the documents connected to his new position as CEO. When the official notice arrived from the bank, the attorney stepped out of the room for several minutes to make a call and verify it. Then he returned, carrying a folder that had been delivered to the house earlier. Everyone was still laughing and talking when he placed it on the table. The company has a new owner. According to my mother, the room became so quiet that she could hear the ice striking the sides of the glasses. Richard grabbed the folder. Daniel jumped to his feet so quickly that his chair fell backward. No one understood how an acquisition of that size could have been completed on the very night they were celebrating. Less than 10 minutes later, my private phone began to ring. The name of my mother appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. The moment I held the phone to my ear, I heard several voices in the background. Someone was asking Richard what had happened. A woman kept mentioning the attorney. The sound of glasses and dishes striking one another allowed me to picture the chaos in the room. My mother did not greet me. "Serena, where are you?" "At the base." Her voice trembled so badly that the words were almost impossible to understand. "Then why is your signature on the agreement to acquire the company of Daniel?" I looked out the window. The parking lot was still quiet. Military vehicles sat motionless beneath the security lights, completely different from the confusion on the other end of the call. Before I could answer, I heard Daniel take the phone from her hand. "Did you buy the company just to humiliate me in front of the entire family?" His voice was so loud that I had to move the phone away from my ear. I did not blame Daniel for reacting that way. If I had been in his position, learning that I had lost control of the company on the very night my family was honoring me, revenge might have been the first explanation that came to my mind as well. But I was not going to explain anything over the phone. Not while he was angry, not while Richard was standing beside him, and certainly not while the room was filled with people who wanted a story simple enough to let them choose a side. "Come to the board meeting tomorrow," I said. "Then you will learn who truly caused you to lose everything." Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he gave a dry laugh. "You have always believed you were better than everyone else." I did not answer. He ended the call first. I placed the phone on the desk and completed my shift as though nothing had happened. I reviewed the final reports of the day, signed the turnover documents, and walked through the soldiers' housing area before sunrise. My replacement arrived at 6 o'clock. I went home, showered, changed out of my uniform and into a dark blue suit, then drove toward the headquarters of Brooks Manufacturing. I had slept for less than 2 hours, but my mind was clearer than it had been on any morning in months. The meeting began at 10 o'clock. The conference room was on the second floor, overlooking the large factory complex, with gray metal roofs and smokestacks that had been operating since before I was born. Several members of the board were already there. The attorney sat at the far end of the table. Beside him were 2 forensic auditors from Carter Meridian. Daniel entered with Richard. He was wearing the same dark suit from the photographs my mother had sent after his appointment ceremony. But his confidence was gone. Richard still appeared calm, although the hand gripping his leather briefcase showed that he was not as comfortable as he wanted everyone to believe. Daniel sat across from me. No one exchanged greetings. The lead auditor began with the cash position, the loans, and the tax obligations. The first set of numbers was enough to drain the color from the faces of several board members. Then she moved to the unusual transactions. Over the previous 18 months, more than $12 million had left the accounts of Brooks Manufacturing. The money had been divided into smaller amounts and transferred to 3 consulting and supply companies that had no actual employees, no warehouses, and no clear business operations. The registered address of one company was a rented mailbox. The second company used the address of an empty office. The third had existed only on paper for less than 2 years. Every payment had been approved through the highest level executive account. The name on the transfer orders was Daniel Brooks. The electronic signature was also the signature of Daniel. The atmosphere in the room changed. Daniel stopped looking at me. He lowered his eyes to the statements being passed across the table, turning the pages as though he hoped the numbers might disappear on their own. The lead auditor placed the final folder in front of him. If we turned all of the evidence over to investigators, Daniel could lose his position, have his assets frozen, and face criminal charges. He looked up, his face completely pale. I have never seen these companies before. No one answered immediately. I looked at the date of a transaction worth nearly $800,000. The transfer had been approved at 2:14 in the morning, while Daniel was attending a public conference in New York. That was the moment I understood that the signatures in the records might be genuine, but the story behind them might not be. Daniel might have been a careless executive. He might have been arrogant, hungry for recognition, and willing to enjoy the benefits of a position he was not qualified to hold. But the numbers in front of us suggested another possibility, and it was far more disturbing. Someone had placed Daniel in the highest position, not to give him power. They had placed him there to make certain that when everything collapsed, his name would appear on every piece of evidence. I watched Daniel for several more seconds, then turned my attention to Richard. He remained seated at the head of the table, both hands resting on his leather briefcase, as though the numbers being presented had nothing to do with him. Throughout the meeting, he had asked almost no questions. He only glanced at the attorney from time to time, then looked back at Daniel. That was not the expression of a man who had just discovered that the family company was being drained from within. It was the expression of a man waiting to see whether his plan could still be saved. The lead auditor opened the second folder. It did not contain ordinary financial statements. It contained login records, device histories, electronic authentication logs, and orders that changed access privileges within the accounting system of Brooks Manufacturing. The account registered to Daniel had approved every transaction, but on many of those occasions, Daniel had not even been in North Carolina. One transfer had been signed while Daniel was speaking at the conference in New York. Another took place while he was flying to Dallas. Data from the company phone showed that the device of Daniel was hundreds of miles from headquarters, while his account was still being accessed through the internal network inside the executive office. Someone had used the access credentials of Daniel from inside the building. Daniel looked up. I told you that I did not make these transactions. No one argued with him. The lead auditor pushed a copy of an authentication reset request toward him. The document had been signed 14 months earlier and gave a second person the authority to restore access to the executive account of Daniel in an emergency. The person who received that authority was Richard Brooks. Daniel picked up the page. His eyes moved slowly over each line, then stopped at the signature at the bottom. The signature carried his name, but it did not look like his other signatures. Daniel looked at his father. Richard kept his voice calm. That is an internal procedure. Every company has backup access. The lead auditor did not argue. She opened another document. The backup authentication code had been used 42 times. Most of those logins came from the computer inside the private office of Richard. The air in the room grew heavy. I had known this before the meeting began. The Carter Meridian team had spent nearly 3 weeks tracing devices, network addresses, and password change histories. We could not identify every transaction through a single piece of evidence, but when the pieces were placed together, the picture was too clear to ignore. Richard did not merely know what was happening, he controlled the entire system. The 3 shell companies that received money from Brooks Manufacturing had different representatives, but the bank accounts behind them eventually led to the same asset management company registered in the Cayman Islands. The beneficiary did not appear publicly in the incorporation records. However, an intermediary bank had kept the customer identification declaration from the day the account was opened. The name on that declaration was Richard Brooks. More than $12 million had been transferred out of the company in 18 months. Some of it returned to the United States through real estate and trusts. The rest remained in overseas accounts. Daniel began turning the pages in front of him quickly. At first, he did it with anger. Then his movements began to slow. I recognized the change. It was the moment when a person stopped searching for reasons to deny the truth and began trying to understand how long he had been deceived. Richard leaned back in his chair. These documents prove nothing. I founded this company. I have the authority to move capital. You have the authority to move capital for legitimate business purposes, the Carter Meridian attorney said. You do not have the authority to send money to companies that provide no services, hide the beneficiary, and place the name of your son on every approval. Richard turned toward Daniel. Do not let them frighten you. This is a hostile takeover. Serena wants to divide the family. I had been waiting for him to say that, not because I wanted to hear it, but because I knew he would. People who are accustomed to controlling others rarely begin with evidence. They begin by turning every question into an act of betrayal. Daniel looked at me. There was still anger in his eyes, but behind it was something else. Fear. It was not a fear that had first appeared in the conference room. It was a fear that had existed before and had only now been dragged into the light. I signaled for the lead auditor to open the final document. It was an internal memorandum that had never been sent. It had been found in an archived folder on the computer of Richard. The document had been drafted 6 weeks earlier, just before Daniel was appointed CEO. It proposed that all responsibility for financial transactions made since the beginning of the year would belong to the person serving as CEO at the time the misconduct was discovered. That person was Daniel. Beneath it was a draft of the board meeting minutes, claiming that Richard had withdrawn from daily management several months earlier. That was not true. The access records showed that he continued approving decisions, contacting the bank, and directing the finance department almost every day. But if the company collapsed before anyone examined the data, the paper records would tell a completely different story. Richard had stepped away from management. Daniel was the CEO. Daniel signed the transfer orders. Daniel was responsible. I looked directly at him. You were not placed in that position to save the company. Daniel did not answer. I continued. You were placed there, so you would be standing in the right place when the company collapsed. Richard slammed his hand against the table. Enough. It was the first time he lost control. The sound was sharp and forceful, but no one flinched. Everyone had seen too many documents for the strike of one hand against a table to change anything. Richard stood and pointed at me. You walked in here, used your money to buy the company of my family, and decided that gave you the right to judge me. I did not raise my voice. No. I used my money to keep this company out of bankruptcy. The investigators will decide the judgment if these records are turned over. He looked around the room, waiting for someone to support him. No one spoke. Even the longtime attorney for Brooks Manufacturing avoided his eyes. Daniel was still staring at the memorandum in front of him. Both hands rested flat on the table, but his fingers were trembling slightly. I had seen that reaction in young soldiers when they realized that someone they trusted had hidden something serious from them. Anger usually came first. Pain came afterward. I pulled the black folder toward me and placed it directly in front of Daniel. Inside was all of the evidence connected to the access records, the shell companies, the overseas accounts, and the draft that placed responsibility on him. You have 24 hours. Daniel looked up. To do what? To decide whether you want to become a witness or be investigated as an accomplice. Richard immediately interrupted. Daniel, do not say anything. They are trying to force you to confess. I did not look at Richard. I looked only at Daniel. You have two choices. Cooperate with the investigation and tell the truth, or keep protecting your father and share responsibility with him. Daniel jumped to his feet. The chair was shoved hard behind him. He picked up the folder and looked at me as though he wanted to throw it in my face. Instead, he swept everything onto the floor. The papers scattered and slid across the gray carpet. You have been waiting for this day for a long time, have you not? I did not answer immediately. Daniel was breathing hard. He looked at me, then at Richard. In that moment, the anger on his face was not directed entirely at me. You have always hated that Mom saw me as more successful than you. I never hated you because Mom loved you. You bought my company. I bought a company that was being stolen. Daniel clenched his jaw. That is the same thing. No, you only want it to be the same thing because that is easier than admitting that your father used your name. He fell silent, only for a very brief moment. But I saw it. A person who was completely surprised would have denied it immediately. Daniel did not. His eyes moved toward Richard, then quickly turned away. He had suspected something. He might not have known the full scale of it. He might not have known where the money had gone, but he had known for a long time that something was wrong. Daniel stepped over the papers on the floor and walked directly toward the door. Richard called after him. Daniel did not stop. The door slammed hard enough to make the glass wall shake. Richard bent down and picked up his briefcase. You will regret this. I remained still. You should use the time you have left to find your own attorney. He looked at me for several seconds, then left the room without saying anything else. The meeting ended soon afterward. The audit team collected the documents, sealed the copies, and transferred access to the systems to the temporary management team. I signed the necessary papers and left the headquarters in the early afternoon. Outside, the factory was still operating. The sound of machinery echoed through the metal walls. Trucks lined up at the loading docks. Workers moved between the buildings, many of them unaware that their company had been only days away from bankruptcy. I sat in my car for a while before starting the engine. I did not feel relieved. We had saved the payroll, but the truth had just torn a family into two sides, and I knew my mother would not need much time to decide which side she would choose. She called me before I reached Fayetteville. I saw her name on the screen, but did not answer immediately. I drove several more miles, turned into the parking lot of a closed store, and then took the call. Her voice was quieter than it had been the night before. Serena, I need you to stop this. There was no greeting. There was no question about how I was feeling after the long shift. She only wanted me to stop. Does Mom know what happened in the meeting? Richard said you are trying to turn Daniel into a criminal. Richard transferred millions of dollars out of the company. He said they were investments. Investments in companies with no employees and no services to provide. My mother fell silent. Then she changed direction, as she always did when a truth became too difficult to face. Daniel could be arrested. I know. You say that as though it does not matter. Of course it matters. That is why I gave him the opportunity to cooperate. My mother began to cry. She did not cry loudly. I heard only broken breaths that reminded me of the calls she made after my father died. For a moment, I almost softened. Then she said the words that made everything clear. You have always been jealous of him. I closed my eyes. Outside the car, a dry leaf blew across the parking lot. I heard traffic moving in the distance and felt both of my hands resting quietly on the steering wheel. You bought the company just as he became chief executive officer, my mother continued. You could not stand the thought of him being more successful than you. Some words do not hurt because they are new. They hurt because they finally confirm what we have spent years trying to deny. My mother had not called to ask what Daniel had done. She had not asked whether Richard had really taken the money. She had called to ask me to protect the image of the family, just as she had asked me not to come home for Thanksgiving so I would not interfere with the evening planned for Daniel. This time, I did not remain silent. You have never protected me. The other end of the call became completely quiet. I spoke slowly, so that none of my words could be dismissed as temporary anger. You only protect the person who makes you feel as though you have a successful family. Serena, when you thought I was poor, you told me not to come home because you were afraid I would make everyone uncomfortable. Now that you know I own the company, you are not asking why it was about to collapse. You are only asking how Daniel can avoid responsibility. He is your brother, and I am your daughter. She said nothing. I could hear her crying, but for the first time in my life, I did not rush to ease the pain she had chosen for herself. I do not want Daniel to go to prison, I said, but I will not allow 600 families to lose their livelihoods just so you can continue believing that he is perfect. I ended the call before she could answer. Not because I wanted to punish her. After 37 years, I had finally understood that some conversations change only when the person who has always stepped aside decides to stand still. 5. I reached my house on Morganton Road after darkness had settled over the city. Haymount was quiet after the holiday. The houses along the street still glowed with light, but there were no children running across the yards, and no smell of food drifting through open porches. I parked in the driveway and sat there for several minutes before getting out. The call with my mother still weighed heavily on my mind. I had said things I had kept inside for years. I did not feel the relief I had once imagined. The truth does not always free us immediately. First, it makes it impossible for everything to return to its former shape. I changed out of my suit, put on a dark sweater, and made coffee. I had eaten nothing since morning, but I did not feel hungry. The Brooks manufacturing file was still on the kitchen table. I opened it, reviewed the list of transactions, and marked the times when Daniel had not been present at the company. At about 9:30, the doorbell rang. I checked the security camera before walking into the hall. Daniel was standing on the porch. He was not wearing the suit from the dinner or the board meeting. He wore jeans, a gray jacket, and carried no briefcase. His car was parked on the street instead of in the driveway, as though he did not want anyone to know he had come. I opened the door, but I did not step aside immediately. Daniel looked over my shoulder and into the house. I need to talk. I let him inside. He walked directly into the living room, but did not sit down. For several seconds, Daniel stood in front of the window and looked at the lights across the street. The anger from the board meeting was gone. In its place was the exhaustion of a man who had spent the entire day facing something he had avoided for months. I placed a glass of water in front of him and sat in the chair across from him. Daniel did not touch it. I knew something was wrong, he said. It was not a complete confession, but it was a beginning. Daniel told me that 6 months earlier, he had discovered a large payment to a consulting company he had never heard of. When he asked the finance department about it, the employee in charge said the payment had been approved through his account. Daniel checked the system and found his electronic signature. He had not signed it. At first, Daniel thought it was a technical error. Richard explained that some transactions had been processed on behalf of Daniel to save time. He told Daniel to focus on clients, the public image of the company, and meetings with investors. Daniel believed his father. Or, more accurately, he chose to believe him because the explanation was convenient. 2 months later, Daniel found 3 more transactions of the same kind. This time, the total exceeded $1 million. Daniel secretly copied the records, but he did not know where to take them. If he reported them to the board, the information might reach Richard before an investigation could begin. If he went to the police without enough evidence, he feared his father would erase every trace. Daniel knew that several investment funds were watching struggling manufacturing companies. He sent an anonymous package of documents to several of them, including Carter Meridian. I looked at him. "You sent the first records." Daniel nodded. I remembered the electronic package our team had received 6 months earlier. It contained copies of transfers, several internal emails, and a list of intermediary companies. The sender had written only that Brooks Manufacturing was being drained from within, and that if no one intervened, 600 workers would lose everything. My team had tried to identify the sender, but they had failed. I had never imagined it was Daniel. "You wanted an investor to discover what was happening," I said. "I wanted someone to force him to stop, but you did not want to be that person yourself." Daniel looked down at his hands. My words made him uncomfortable, but he did not argue. He told me that after he sent the records, Richard unexpectedly promoted him to chief executive officer. Daniel had believed it was a sign that his father was finally beginning to trust him. He was moved into a larger office, appeared at company events, and was introduced to the press as the next generation of leadership. My mother held a dinner. Richard bought Daniel a new car through the company. The board of directors stood and applauded him. Daniel knew the numbers were wrong, but he also liked the way people looked at him. He liked being called the chief executive officer. He liked the photographs taken in front of the company building. He liked hearing my mother tell anyone who would listen that he was the pride of the family. Daniel could have stepped forward and told the truth. He did not. "I am not innocent," he said. "I did not take the money. But I saw enough to know that I should have asked more questions." I did not try to soften his confession. Honesty has meaning only when a person accepts every ugly part of it. Daniel said Richard had once discovered him copying some of the records. Richard did not admit to embezzlement. Instead, he warned Daniel that if he continued causing trouble, my mother would suffer the consequences. The home where my mother and Richard lived was held by a trust controlled by Richard. Her investment and insurance accounts were also under his control. Richard said he could sell the house, close the accounts, and leave her with nowhere to go. Daniel believed he was capable of doing it. "I thought that if I stayed quiet long enough, an investor would step in," he said. "I thought they would save the company without ever knowing who had sent the records, and you could keep your position." Daniel closed his eyes. Yes, that was the most difficult confession he made. He had not remained silent only because of my mother. He had remained silent because he was afraid, but also because of his pride. He wanted Richard to be stopped, but he also wanted to keep everything his father had given him. Daniel looked up. His eyes were red, but he was not crying. "I wanted someone to save the company. I just never thought that person would be you." I sat quietly for a while. 17 years in the army had taught me that courage rarely appears in a perfect form. Sometimes people step forward too late. Sometimes they tell the truth only after every other escape has closed. That does not erase responsibility. But it can still be a place to begin. I told Daniel that Carter Meridian had already provided the preliminary records to the legal team and the forensic auditors. If he cooperated, the attorneys could clearly explain his role, the documents he had sent, and the transactions he had not made. No one could promise that he would face no consequences. On paper, Daniel was still the chief executive officer. He had ignored warning signs. He had benefited from the position Richard created to conceal the scheme, but the difference between an accomplice and a witness is found in what that person does when the truth finally appears. "I will help you prove what you did not do," I said. "But you must accept responsibility for what you did." Daniel looked at me for a long time, then nodded. The next morning, he met with the Carter Meridian legal team. For nearly 6 hours, Daniel provided passwords, emails, meeting schedules, and every conversation with Richard that remained on his devices. He signed a statement, gave permission for his devices to be examined, and agreed to testify. Before leaving the office, Daniel received a call from his father. He did not answer it in front of us. The attorney suggested that Daniel meet Richard as he normally would, without making accusations and without revealing that he had agreed to cooperate. If Richard believed his son was still afraid, he might say what the documents had not yet proven. The legal team confirmed that recording the conversation in that manner complied with the law. Daniel agreed. That evening, he went to the private office of Richard. I was not there, but I later listened to the entire recording. Daniel asked his father whether there was any way to explain the transactions. Richard said no explanation was needed if Daniel knew how to remain silent. He insisted that the board would believe the chief executive officer was responsible. Daniel asked why his signature appeared on the records. Richard answered that an electronic signature was only a tool. He said he had used the backup access and had forged several documents because Daniel was not decisive enough to do what needed to be done. Then Richard said something that left even the attorneys silent. He had prepared his passport, transferred most of the money overseas, and planned to leave the United States as soon as the final payment was released. If the investigation began, Daniel would be the one left behind to explain everything. Richard said it with the calm confidence of a man who believed his son would never dare to resist him. 2 days later, the board held a second emergency meeting. This time, legal representatives, auditors, and 2 investigators were waiting in an adjoining room. They did not enter immediately. The purpose of the meeting was to give Richard an official opportunity to respond to the evidence. He arrived with his own attorney. My mother was also there, even though she was not a member of the board. Richard said she needed to hear the truth from him, not from people who were trying to destroy the family. I sat across from Daniel. He looked calmer than he had during the previous meeting, but his hands remained tightly clasped beneath the table. Richard began by denying access to the overseas accounts. Then, when the attorney presented login data from the office of Richard, he changed his story. He said Daniel had used his computer. When he was asked about the forged signatures, he said his son often asked him to handle paperwork. When he was asked about the shell companies, Richard turned directly toward Daniel. He did all of it. He is the chief executive officer. He controls the money. My mother looked at Daniel, her face completely pale. Richard continued. He said Daniel was greedy, inexperienced, and trying to hide his failures by blaming his father. He claimed Daniel had transferred the money overseas and was now trying to drag the entire family down with him. He spoke smoothly. Richard had probably practiced that story for months. Daniel allowed him to finish. Then he took out his phone, placed it in the center of the table, and pressed play. The voice of Richard filled the room. Clear, calm, impossible to mistake. He admitted using the account of Daniel. He admitted forging signatures. He admitted transferring money to companies he controlled. Finally, he described his plan to leave the United States and allow his son to accept responsibility. No one moved until the recording ended. My mother raised one hand to her mouth. Richard looked at Daniel as though he had realized for the first time that his son was no longer under his control. The 2 investigators entered immediately afterward. Richard was arrested for fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and planning to transfer assets illegally out of the country. He did not resist. He only turned to my mother and told her not to trust anyone in the room. But this time, she did not move toward him. The financial investigation continued over the following days. The final truth did not end with Brooks Manufacturing. Richard had forged the signature of my mother on the mortgage documents for the house. He had borrowed a large amount against the value of the property, then transferred the money into private accounts. Nearly all of her retirement savings had also been withdrawn gradually over 3 years. She had believed the lower balances were caused by changes in the market. In reality, the husband she trusted was preparing to leave without giving her anything. My mother sat in the office of the attorney while the documents were placed in front of her. She did not cry immediately. She only stared at the forged signature bearing her name. Then at the transactions Richard had made during the same days when they continued eating dinner together like an ordinary family. Finally, she asked a very quiet question. Was he going to leave me behind? No one needed to answer. The answer was written on every page. That was when my mother finally understood that the man she had defended for years had never truly considered her family. He had viewed her, Daniel, and all of us as people he could use, as long as we continued believing the story he wanted to tell. In the days after Richard was arrested, Brooks Manufacturing was no longer a company waiting to be rescued. It had become a place that needed to be rebuilt, almost from the ground up. The accounts were frozen. The bank demanded a clear recovery plan before releasing more capital. Suppliers wanted to know whether they would be paid. Workers came to the factory every morning, but none of them knew whether they would still have jobs the following week. News of the investigation spread faster than any official announcement. I received dozens of emails from people I had never met. A man who worked in assembly wrote that his wife had just begun cancer treatment and that the health insurance of his family depended entirely on the company. A woman who had worked in packaging for 26 years asked whether her pension still existed. No one asked how long Richard might remain in prison. They only wanted to know whether their lives could continue. Carter Meridian had enough authority to choose the easiest path. We could close one of the two plants, sell the land, liquidate the equipment, and dismiss almost half of the workforce. The remaining assets would still be valuable enough for the fund to recover its investment and earn a large profit. Some advisors believed that was the reasonable decision. They were not wrong. On paper, Brooks Manufacturing had been damaged too deeply. The company had lost customers, lost credibility, and carried debts created over many years. Keeping the entire workforce meant investing millions more with no guarantee that the money would ever be recovered. I listened to every opinion. Then I asked to visit the factory before making a decision. I did not announce my visit. That morning, I wore a dark blue shirt, slacks, and low shoes. I did not wear my uniform. I did not bring attorneys or a group of advisors. The plant manager guided me through the production areas. The sound of metal presses repeated through the building. The smell of oil, metal dust, and old coffee mixed in the air. Workers watched as I passed, but most of them did not know who I was. In the assembly area, an older man was showing a young worker how to inspect a machine part. He repeated each step until the younger man did it correctly. In another corner, a woman continued working while attaching a photograph of her daughter in a graduation gown to the side of her tool cabinet. I looked at the calloused hands, the worn safety boots, and the exhausted faces of people who had spent weeks wondering what would happen to their future. They were no longer 618 names in a spreadsheet. They were 618 lives. I thought about Michael. He once said that a good system was not the one that made the most money. It was the one that did not forget the person standing at the end of the line. I returned to the Carter Meridian conference room that afternoon and asked the financial team to prepare a different plan. We would not sell the factory. We would not carry out mass layoffs. The fund would pay every overdue paycheck, maintain health insurance, and restore the money that had been taken from the pension fund. Assets recovered from Richard would be used first to repay the company and its workers. But I asked for one more thing that left even the most experienced advisors silent. Carter Meridian would transfer 51% ownership of Brooks Manufacturing into a trust for the employees. The shares would be managed for the benefit of the people who worked at the company. When the business earned a profit, they would receive a portion of it. Major decisions about closing the plant, selling assets, or reducing the pension fund would no longer remain entirely in the hands of one family. One advisor asked whether I understood how much money I was giving up. I understood. I also understood what would happen if power remained concentrated in the hands of one person who could use a company like a private bank account. The board meeting was held the following week. It was the same conference room where Daniel had swept the folder onto the floor, but this time, the board members were joined by representatives for the workers, department heads, and managers who had spent decades at Brooks Manufacturing. When I presented the plan, no one responded immediately. Some thought they had misunderstood me. The representative for the workers asked whether it was real ownership or only a temporary bonus program. I explained that the ownership would be written into the new legal structure. No one could take it back through a single decision. The workers would have representatives on the board and regular access to financial reports. A man at the far end of the table lowered his head. Then I saw him wipe his eyes. I looked around the room. I did not buy this company so I could own it. I bought it so innocent people would not have to pay for the greed of someone else. No one applauded immediately. There was only a long silence, as though everyone needed time to believe that what they had heard was real. Then the representative for the workers stood. The others stood with him. I do not remember who began applauding first. I only remember that the sound began quietly, then spread across the room. I did not feel as though I had won. I felt only that we had returned the company to the people who had truly built it. Daniel submitted his resignation as chief executive officer the following morning. He did not hold a press conference. He did not send a long letter of explanation. He simply stood before the board and admitted that he had ignored the warning signs and had benefited from his position while knowing that something was wrong. Daniel promised to return every bonus, the company car, and every benefit he had received while holding the position. He continued cooperating with investigators and provided additional records that helped recover assets from Richard. The legal team recommended that Daniel leave the company entirely. I did not agree immediately. Not because he was my brother. I wanted to know whether he was truly willing to begin again in a place without attention, without a title, and without anyone standing to applaud him. In the end, Daniel accepted a lower position in operations, under the direct supervision of a manager who was not a member of the Brooks family. He had no private office, he had no company car, he was not allowed to participate in financial decisions for at least 2 years. On his first day back, Daniel wore protective clothing and reported to the factory floor at 7 in the morning. Some workers did not greet him. A few looked at him with open contempt. Daniel did not react. He completed his shift and returned the following day. I did not know how long he would continue, but for the first time, Daniel had to build something without his father opening the door for him. My mother moved into a small apartment near Fayetteville after the house entered the asset recovery process. She lost nearly all of her savings, but the legal team helped protect part of her retirement income. During the first few weeks, my mother called me many times. I did not always answer. I needed distance to understand whether she truly wanted to repair our relationship or whether she was only afraid because Richard was no longer beside her. One Sunday afternoon, she came to my house on Morganton Road. She did not call first. She brought no gift. She stood on the porch in an old coat, looking much smaller than the woman who had once told me not to come home for Thanksgiving. I invited her inside. We sat in the living room. My mother looked around the house as though she had realized for the first time that I had built a life without needing her approval. She did not begin by explaining how Richard had deceived her. She did not mention Daniel. I was wrong. I remained silent. My mother rested both hands on her knees. I was so busy looking at the success of other people that I failed to see that the strongest person in this family had been standing in front of me all along. I did not know how many times she had practiced those words, but her voice did not sound rehearsed. It was broken, imperfect, and did not try to make her look better. She admitted that she had used the career of Daniel to prove that marrying Richard had been the right choice. Every success Daniel achieved made her feel that her new family was complete. I was too independent and asked for too little, so she convinced herself that I did not need attention. My mother had mistaken my silence for a kind of strength that did not need love. I looked at her for a long time. I cannot forgive you yet, but if you truly want to change, I will give us a chance to begin again. She nodded. She did not ask me to hug her. She did not ask how long it would take before I forgave her. That was the first thing that made me believe she might finally understand. We began with short calls every Sunday. Then we met for coffee once a month. My mother asked about my work and tried to listen to the answer instead of quickly changing the subject. Sometimes she still made mistakes. Sometimes I was colder than I needed to be. Trust does not return because of one apology. It is rebuilt through small actions, repeated again and again, on days when no one is watching. 1 year later, Brooks Manufacturing held a Thanksgiving dinner inside the factory. Long tables were arranged in the old assembly hall. Workers brought their families, veterans from the community, people with nowhere else to go, and families facing hardship were also invited. My mother arrived early to help arrange the food. Daniel stood at the serving area, wearing an apron, and placing mashed potatoes on every plate. He was no longer the chief executive officer. No one called him by a title. But I noticed that some workers had begun speaking to him as a fellow employee. I was not wearing my uniform. I did not mention Carter Meridian or the shares I still owned. For several hours, we were only 3 members of the same family, standing together among people who had survived a year that had nearly taken everything from them. Near the end of the evening, my mother sat on my left. Daniel sat across from me. No one raised a glass to praise one person while making another feel small. We simply ate, talked, and learned how to be together without pretending. As I looked around the room, I understood that the value of a person had never been found in military rank, the title of chief executive officer, or the amount of money they owned. It was found in the people they chose to protect when they had the power to decide. 1 year earlier, my mother had told me not to come home because she believed I was not successful enough to sit at the same table as Daniel. 1 year later, the people who had once been overlooked owned the place where they had spent their lives working. For the first time in many years, Thanksgiving was no longer a day for my family to boast about what we had. It became a day when we gave thanks for the chance to repair what we had damaged.